Wargamers, painters, ladies and gentlemen and everybody else, the time has come for the much promised video that I've finally been able to make. It is the Fellowship of the Ring. Now, this is not a speed painting video. This is a video on how to take all of your Fellowship models and turn them into something that is worthy of being in a display cabinet, or at least to look fantastic on a table. Anybody can achieve these results. It is a comprehensive guide. We're going to go through every single character individually from start to finish. This is the definitive Fellowship of the Ring painting guide. Now let's get cracking. As always, the first thing we need to do is undercoat our models. It's always best if you can use a colour that's going to appear in lots of the models because it saves you a little bit of work. And for that I have used Mechanicus Standard Grey, or in this case Standard Grey from Colourforge, but it's the same thing. You want to make sure you've got a nice even smooth coat all over your models, and then you're ready to start painting. First model we're going to paint is Boromir, played by Sean Bean in the films, and of course, as Sean Bean does in lots of films, he dies. Spoiler alert. We're going to start with Abaddon Black, and we're going to start painting in some of the robes. In this case, his outer robe is going to be black and the inner will be red, but we'll come on to that soon. Make sure you're nice and neat. Doesn't matter if you overlap too much on this particular stage because none of the model is going to be grey, so we will be painting every element. Next you're going to need Khorne Red, and we're going to start painting in the other half of his tunic slash garments. That's the bit in the middle there, his sleeves, and then we're going to paint the front of his shield. You may find that your first layer of Khorne Red is a little bit transparent, so feel free to give it a couple of coats because we want these to look as good as possible. Next up, grab your Rhinox Hide. We're going to use this nice medium brown to paint in the back of the shield and all of the leather details on the model and his hair, because he's got brown hair. With that done, it's time to grab some Iron Hand steel to paint the metal details. Now, Boromir's wearing chainmail under his tunic, so you'll have to do the sleeve that's showing through. You'll have to paint his sword, the rim of his shield and the bit in the centre, and that should be all the metal. If you want to go extra detailed, you can look at the front of his tunic and paint the metal clasps that are holding the front of his leather armour together. Next, equip yourself with Zandri Dust. We're going to use that to paint in the Horn of Gondor on his back. Next, it's time to give the whole model a good shade with Nuln Oil. To do that, we're just going to put some on a fairly fluffy brush, and we're just going to put it all over the model. Now, you don't want so much that it's running off the base and onto your kitchen floor slash carpet, leading to your untimely execution by your partner. You just need enough to run into all of the recesses and all of the details and make it stand out. Once that's dry, Boromir is going to look like this. It's brought everything down, made it all look a bit grimy, a bit dirty, as it would be for real. So now we can start painting in some of the extra details and start making everything stand out. And to start with, we're going to paint his face using Cadian Fleshtone. Now, let me say at this point, I know what you're thinking. I can't paint faces. And by that I don't mean I mean you. Faces are notoriously difficult to paint, especially on slightly bigger models, so people tend to just stick a helmet on their models. We know who you are, Space Marine players, and then they tend to ignore them. I'm going to show you here a way that you can paint them really quickly and really easily while still making them look really decent. The first thing you need to do is what we're doing right now, which is that nice layer of Cadian Fleshtone. Now, when you're painting faces, you always want to make sure that your paints are nice and watered down. Firstly, so they flow off the brush nicely, but secondly, so that you don't obscure all of the details with really heavy blobs of pigment. The likelihood is that after this coat, you'll need to apply a second thin coat of Cadian Fleshtone over the face. We're only going to paint the face on this particular model because it's exactly the same process for all the rest of them, and once I've shown you on this one, then the rest of the video will just be showing you how to paint the main colours on each of the models. So now it's time to use Reikland Fleshshade, and we're going to put that all over the skin area we've just painted, or on other models you'd put it over all of the skin areas. This is going to settle in the recesses and show us all the details on the face, and we can then paint round those areas in order to make everything stand out. You don't want so much on his face that it turns into one big skin toned blob. You want it to kind of settle in the eye sockets, around the nose and across the mouth and around the edge of the face. So here's what it's going to look like when it dries. Now a lot of people could just leave it at this stage, and you can if you want to, but there's one major detail on Boromir's face we're missing, and that is his goatee. So you're going to need to get your Rhinox Hide out again, and we're going to very carefully paint the facial hair that's on the front of his face. Once you've done that, you're going to need to equip yourself with Cadian Fleshtone again, and what we're going to do with a very watered down layer of Cadian Fleshtone is re-highlight all of the skin tone details. So you're going to need to do his mouth through the middle, you're going to need to do his nose, you're going to have to paint his cheeks and his forehead, but what you want to do is avoid the deepest recesses, so either side of his nose and in his eye sockets. Now once this layer is dry, if you're happy with it, just leave it. If you know you're not very good at painting faces, or you think you're just going to mess it up, then leave it. It will look perfectly good on the tabletop. However, if you want to take them to the next level, then equip yourself with Kislev Flesh and basically repeat the process you're doing now, but only do it on the raised parts of the cheek, on the nose and on the eyebrows, and then for other models on the chin where the light would naturally catch, and it will look even better. Next, equip yourself with Gorthor Brown. You're probably wondering why I haven't done the eyes. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but for now we need to fill in all of the detail on the leather. So for this, we're just going to highlight all of the edges of all the leather straps. We're going to put some streaky lines following the grain of the wood on the shield just to make that stand out, and basically give everything that little bit of extra pop. You want to make sure your paint's got a decent amount of water in it, and you want to make sure that you're very controlled with how much you put on your brush, because you want these to be little straight lines. I haven't got some fantastic amazing fancy brush here. I'm literally using an army painter detail brush, so it's more than achievable for anyone watching. Once you've done the leather detail in the shield and his boots, next we're going to go on to his hair. Now his hair is actually really easy. Using the same thin line technique you've just been using to do the highlighting, just pick out a few strands of hair and draw lines down his head, and this will highlight the edge of the hair and make it look a little bit shiny. Next you're going to need Wazdakka Red, and we're going to use that to highlight the red. Exactly the same technique we used on the leather. We're just going to pick the raised folds of the cloth on his clothing, and we're just going to give that an edge highlight. It's going to make it really stand out. Next you'll need Eshin Grey, and we're going to use that to highlight all of the black areas. Exactly the same technique we just used on the red, except now we're doing it with grey on top of the black. Nice and easy. Next you're going to need Retributor Armour, and that is to paint in the gold detailing on his tunic and the top of his horn. Start off by doing an edge highlight over the red round the rim of the sleeve, and that is going to start off our pattern. Once you've done that, you're then going to need to draw some little lines coming off the gold, and this is our first little bit of freehand that we need to do on this model. Once those lines are completed, you're then just going to draw some little equidistant dots, and that is going to be the little stars that are on his tunic. You don't have to be super immaculate, amazing freehand painter to do this, because you're going to be looking at the model at a distance and it's very small, but you will really notice that detailing and it will really stand out. Once you've done that, spin the model round and paint the gold detailing on the horn. I forgot to do it in this video, but you do need to do it. And now, equipped with some black, it's time to do the hardest part of the model, the eyes. All your painting up till now will be beautiful, and this will be the point you'll ruin it. To start with, you need to paint in the eye socket black, or Rhinox Hide. Either one, it doesn't matter. Most people tend to paint eyes by painting a big white blob in the eye socket first and then attempting to paint a pupil. That doesn't work because your eye is actually very dark around the actual eye socket. So the way we get around that is by painting in black first and then painting in very carefully 2 white dots on either side of the eye. This looks infinitely better than trying to paint it white first. It's very fiddly and it will take you a couple of attempts, but always start with the inside dot first and then the outside. Flip the model over and then do it with the other eye. But that is Boromir done. Now we've got to base him. In the photo at the beginning you will have seen Boromir in the outdoor version, so I used Sterling Mud to base him, but in this case I'm going to show you how to base him Moria style if you'd prefer to do it like that. To do it Moria style you'll need to start with Astra Granite and you're going to paint that all over the base, being very careful not to get it on your model. I'm using an old paintbrush here that I've sacrificed for the greater good of putting sandy texture paint on bases. Leave that to dry and then grab your Agrax Earthshade. We're going to paint that all over the base. Again, try not to get it on your wonderfully painted model, but give it a good coating. What we want this to do is dry and make all of the sand stand out, whilst simultaneously looking nice and dirty and dusty. Once that's dry you'll need Dawnstone and a dry brush, and what you're going to do is dry brush that Dawnstone, not too heavily, all over the base to make the sand details stand out. Once that dries we're going to go up a tone in grey to Administratum Grey, and you want a very light dry brush across the top of the sand. You don't want very much on your brush at all, this is just to catch the most raised parts of the base. Last but not least, grab your Abaddon black and then we're going to paint the base rim, because all professional looking models have a black base rim. Give it a couple of coats to make sure that it's a nice solid colour, and that will be you done. And so here he is, Moria Boromir finished. As you can see, comes out looking absolutely amazing, and yours can too following this guide, okay? It is absolutely achievable. I've just shown you how to do it. It might take a little bit of practice, you might have to work on those lines and getting it nice and thin, but it is doable. Now let's go and do the rest of them and get the whole lot looking amazing.
A wizard is never late. He arrives precisely when he means to.
And Gandalf has arrived. It's time to paint him first, and first we're going to need Macragge Blue to paint his hat, and maybe a couple of other bits too. Now I will of course be accepting comments and praise down below for my fantastic Gandalf impression. Once you're finished with the blue, grab yourself some Rhinox Hide and it's time to paint in all of the wooden and leather details. For that you need to do the belts going across his front, don't forget the little diagonal strap going up through his beard, and paint in his staff. Next grab your Iron Hand, steal the staple of painting Lord of the Rings metal colours and paint in Glamdring, the elven sword. Now we've reached that time with this model as well. You're going to get your Nuln Oil, you're going to get your kind of fluffy brush, and you're going to do the whole lot. Cover it in Nuln Oil, make sure all that detail stands out, because Gandalf's robe is actually grey, hence the name, believe it or not. So cover it in Nuln Oil, and that is him ready for the next steps. The first of those next steps is to grab Dawnstone and to start highlighting the grey. What we're going to do is exactly the same as we did on Boromir. We're going to pick out the edges of the cloth and any raised bits where the cloth is folded over. Basically go around all of the grey and fill that in and make it look nice and detailed. Now for reference, when it's done, this is what it's going to look like. So if you're not sure where to draw your lines, just copy this and you can't go far wrong. Next you're going to need Gorthor Brown, and just like on Boromir you're going to need to highlight all of the edges of the leather straps. So take your time, nice and detailed, and nice and thin lines just along the edges. You have to be pretty careful not to overspill onto anything else, or not just to paint the whole thing Gorthor Brown. So really do take your time. Once you've done that you're going to switch to painting his Staff of Power. Now to do that you'll notice that there's a lot of kind of woody ridges on the staff anyway, and you can follow those down with the edge of your brush to make it look like it's a continuous piece of wood, which is really decent if you get it right. So keep practicing that, and that'll be all the brown highlighted. Next we're going to take that highlight one step up with Baneblade Brown. You really need to have this super thin on the end of your brush, so make sure there's a really good point, and then you're just going to go along a really fine line along the edge of all of that leather, and that's going to make the leather look worn and old. You don't necessarily need to do this on the staff if you want to just leave it a wooden colour. Next, grab yourself Zandri Dust, and we're going to start the process of painting in Gandalf's great bushy beard. So give it a nice base coating of Zandri Dust, and we'll come back to it shortly to make it stand out even more. Oh, and don't forget to do his hair too. It does come out the bottom of his hat round the back. For reference, this is what it looks like when it's all painted and dry. As you can see, there's quite a lot of hair and beard to cover. Next, equip yourself with Seraphim Sepia, and we're going to use that to shade in all of the beard and hair, and that's going to make all of the hairs stand out so we can move on to the next step and make it look really good. Next, you need Ushabti Bone, and that is stage 1 of highlighting the model back up. What we're going to do here is a very careful highlight where we're going to paint in the strands of all the hair, just like we did on Boromir, but they're a little bit more pronounced on Gandalf's beard, so you need to take your time and make sure that you don't just paint in all of the recesses and ruin that Seraphim Sepia layer. Be aware, if this is the first time you've ever attempted to paint hair like this, you will deprive yourself of oxygen holding your breath trying not to make a mistake, and it will probably take you several thousand years. Enjoy! If you're still alive after that highlight, we're going to do the same thing again, but this time very finely down the centre of each hair with Screaming Skull, and that's going to make it look quite white in comparison to how it did before, and is the colour that his hair is supposed to be. Once you've done that, it's time for Calgar Blue, and we're going to highlight the blue, funnily enough. This is really easy, just go around the rim of his hat and you're done. And that's it. Paint his face, paint his eyes, do exactly the same process you did on Boromir, and that's him finished and ready to join the Fellowship. And now we turn our attention to Aragorn to make sure that Strider is painted and ready to get on the tabletop. To start with, you're going to need Caliban Green, and we're going to use that to paint in his jacket. Next, we're going to use Abaddon Black, and we're going to paint in a few areas. The clothes that are showing underneath his tunic, his hair, the cloth that's going across his chest, and all the leather details like his belt, etc. Next up, we're going straight to Gorthor Brown. Now, you might be wondering where the Rhinox Hide step is here, but Aragorn's boots are actually slightly brighter than everyone else's, so we're going to go straight in with Gorthor Brown. You might need a couple of layers to get this to stand out. Now we're going to switch to Rhinox Hide. I'm going to paint in quite a few details. We've got to paint his tunic, we've got to paint the quiver on his back, we've got to paint the straps around his boots, and we've got to paint the cloth that's across his back. Next, we're going with Khorne Red, and that's to paint in his bow. He's got a bit of a redwood bow going, so we're going to use red. Next, we're switching to Iron Hand Steel, and we're going to paint in the metallic items, which is mainly his sword. Next, we need Rakarth Flesh, and that's just for one job, and that's to paint in the feathers on the arrows in his quiver. Now it's the Nuln Oil stage, the part where you know that you're getting somewhere with the model. We're going to cover the entire thing with Nuln Oil in exactly the same way we have done on the last couple of models. Next, you're going to need Waaagh Flesh, and this is going to be our highlight on top of Caliban Green. This is like a dull green colour, and obviously Strider's jacket isn't particularly vibrant in terms of being green, so we're just using this to add a dull green highlight, but a highlight nonetheless. After that, we'll be returning to Gorthor Brown, and we're going to start highlighting all of his tunic. Exactly the same way as we've highlighted brown before, and exactly the same way as we've highlighted clothing before. You're just going to pick out the raised areas of the folds and around the sharpest edges. Whilst you've got your Gorthor Brown out and nicely watered down, don't forget to highlight the other Rhinox Hide areas on the model. Now we're going to go one level up and switch to Baneblade Brown to highlight all of the areas that we just covered with Gorthor Brown. Now this includes his boots, which are obviously painted Gorthor Brown entirely, so just paint a bit around the edge to denote some shine, and then crack on with doing a very fine highlight on all of the Rhinox Hide areas. Next you're going to switch to Eshin Grey, and you're going to highlight all of the black areas in exactly the same fashion as you've just done all of the brown areas. When it comes to Aragorn's hair, you're going to do exactly the same as you did with Boromir, but this time with grey. Once all those areas are painted and highlighted, here's what he's going to look like for reference. Now it's just a case of painting the final remaining details, which is his face. Now remember, for painting faces, we're going to start with our Cadian Fleshtone layer, we're then going to cover it in Reikland Fleshshade, we're then going to repaint Cadian Fleshtone, avoiding all of the recesses, we're then going to give it a highlight of Kislev Flesh, and then we're going to paint in the eyes. Don't forget that whilst you're painting Aragorn's face, he does have a beard, so you'll have to paint it in the same way as Boromir, using some Abaddon black. And here he is, all finished under proper lighting and ready to get stuck into the fight. In fact, this is the bit, this is the exact pose he's in when he chops that goblin's head off in Moria. Love it. Next we're going to paint Legolas, or Orlando Bloom, one of the two. Orlando Bloom in model form. Either way, we're painting the elf with the bow next. To do that you're going to need to start with Caliban Green, and we're going to paint in his tunic. Caliban Green can come out a little bit thin, so you may need a couple of coats to get a nice vibrant green. Next we're going to switch to Macragge Blue when your green layers are dry, and we're going to paint in his undergarments. By that I don't mean his actual underwear, I mean the kind of underlayer he's wearing, so his leggings and his top underneath his tunic. Once that's done, he's going to look like this, just for reference. Next you're going to need to switch to Abaddon Black, and we're going to paint in his little shoes, which are underneath the greaves that are just above it. The other thing you'll need to paint in with black is his quiver that holds all his arrows. After that we're going to switch to Rhinox Hide, and we're going to paint in pretty much everything else on Legolas. So we're going to paint in his braces, his bow, his greaves, his bloody everything else basically. Just don't paint his hair brown, and don't paint the skin brown. Next you can switch to Rakarth Flesh. We're going to use that to paint in the feathers on the arrows, and that's it. Next we're going to switch to Retributor Armour, and we're going to paint in some extra details on his quiver and on the tips of his bow. So just go around the rim, you can quite clearly see that it's metal at the top and at the bottom, and then the same on his bow. Next we're going to use Iron Hand Steel to paint in the metallic items, which is a buckle on his chest and then the handles of his two blades on the back. After that it is Nuln Oil time, so same detail as you did on every other model we've done so far, cover the whole thing in Nuln Oil. Next you're going to switch to Waaagh Flesh, and we're going to paint in his tunic, and by paint it in I mean we're going to do the highlights on it, so exactly the same as we've done with all the other clothes, just pick out the raised folds and give it a good highlight of Waaagh Flesh. We're actually going to do another green highlight up from this, so you can afford for your highlights to be a little bit wider than they would be on Aragorn's jacket. In order to do the next layer of highlights, you're going to need Straken Green, and we're going to do some very thin, fine highlights, just running down over the sharpest creases and over the edges of the green tunic, and that's really going to make it pop. Next is Calgar Blue. You want to water it down a little bit, and using the finest point you can on your brush, you're going to paint in the folds of his blue undergarment things. We haven't decided what we're calling them yet, but you need to paint the folds just as I'm doing in the video, so as neat as you possibly can be to retain that detail. After that we're going to go up one layer to Fenrisian Grey, and you want to use this as sparingly as possible with the finest tip ever on your brush, just where the most raised areas of creases and folds on the clothes are. Next you get Gorthor Brown out, and we're going to do all of the brown highlights exactly the same as you've done on all the other models. And then for reference, this is where he's at up to this point. As you can see, he's starting to look really decent. Next you'll need Eshin Grey, and we're going to use that to highlight his black shoes and the quiver on his back, so a pretty quick job. Next we can use Corax White to highlight the feathers of his arrows, as they're in much better condition than Aragorn's. Next you're going to switch to Zandri Dust, and we're going to be painting his hair. Now you need to be really careful at this point, because you've just spent ages painting the rest of the model, and the last thing you want to do is ruin it now. So as neat as you possibly can, try and catch the hair that's coming under his hands, the hair that's running down onto his shoulders, and then you can breathe a bit easier when you get to painting the hair on his head. Next we're getting some Seraphim Sepia out, and we're going to put that all over the Zandri Dust. Now there's a couple of blonde people in this fellowship, or at least blonde based people, so you're going to get pretty used to this process, so exactly the same as you did on Gandalf. With that done, we're back to Ushabti Bone, and exactly the same as with Gandalf, you're going to paint the strands of hair in the direction that they're going. So to do this, it's good to look at a picture of Legolas to see which way his hair is flowing, from where it's tied and running down his shoulders to pulled back across his head. Have a look at the strands on the model, have a look at a picture, and make sure that you're drawing your lines the right way. Once that's done, he's going to look like this, pretty much there. However, Legolas's hair is really bright, just like Gandalf, so we're going to take it to the next step up, which is to use Screaming Skull and do exactly the same thing we just did, but on the most raised areas of the hair. That's going to make it really stand out as that almost whitish blonde. And with that done, he is pretty much finished. If you've got your own way of painting faces, feel free to use that. Otherwise, use the ones that you've just seen in the other couple of models. And here's what Legolas looks like all fully painted up. There's a slight difference with Legolas in that I went a little bit heavier with the Kislev Flesh, because he's quite a pale elf looking character. The other trick is with the eyes, as you can see. Instead of painting the black or brown background to the eye and then painting in 2 white dots, all I've done is put a single white dot to the left of each eyeball, which gives the impression that the model is looking to his or her left. And then obviously you can do the opposite the other way to get them looking the other way. It's a really handy trick, and one I recommend you use, especially on models that are aiming. And here we are already, Lord of the Rings fans. We are on to Gimli. We are firing through them. Let's learn how to paint him and get him done and on the table with the rest of them. First off, we're going to do the biggest colour, which is Khorne Red. We're going to paint in all of his tunic. Look into the video / at the box art to work out where that needs to go. Oh, you're also going to paint his gloves. Don't forget those. Next it's time for Rhinox Hide. We're going to paint in loads of stuff. We're going to paint in the belt, the helmet, the boots, the beard, loads of stuff. Just have a look at the video, have a look at the box art. It's the easiest way to find out where you need your browns to go, and to ensure that you don't miss anything, trying to squint at what I'm doing on the screen. With those few bits done, he's going to look like this. Oh, and whilst we're here, it turns out I forgot to paint the Khorne Red of his trousers underneath his tunic. Now it's time to paint all the metallic areas. We're going to switch to Iron Hands Steel, and we're going to paint in the blades of his axe, his belt buckle, and a couple of bits of his helmet. Don't forget to paint the chainmail that's showing beneath his tunic, as Gimli is actually wearing a mail vest, and also to do his shoulder pads. His pauldrons, that's the word I'm looking for. And if you couldn't quite see what I was doing in the video, here is the metallic areas all painted just for reference. Next we're going to switch to Retributor Armour and we're going to paint in Gimli's gold details. That's a band around the centre of his helmet. It's the centre of his belt buckle, leaving some of the iron hand steel showing on the outside. And then exactly the same again on the shoulder pads. You're going to paint the central part of the shoulder pad, but leave the edges. Next you're going to switch to Abaddon black, and we've got a couple of fiddly bits to do. So you're going to need to make sure your paint's watered down, you've got a nice thin tip on your brush, and we're going to paint in the lines which are part of Gimli's tunic design. It runs all the way around the outside of the model, so be nice and careful when painting this in. The other area of the model that requires exactly the same treatment is the cross straps on his back. They have a black outline running along them as well. Once you've done those, you're going to continue with Abaddon black and you're going to paint the handles of his axes. Next, get some Zandri Dust, and we're going to use this for one job. That's to paint the bedroll hanging off his back. Though I think you'll notice that in the film it's like a dark grey, so it's hard to tell whether it's because it's covered in dust or what, but we're painting it Zandri Dust, so join me or don't. The choice is totally yours. Now, we all know what's happening here. It's Nuln Oil time. Cover the model, as you have done with all the others. Easy. The easiest step, one might argue. Next we're going to use Baneblade Brown. Now this is a random one that we've not seen so far in the video, but it's for one very specific job, and that is to highlight Gimli's beard, because it's actually a kind of gingery reddy brown, and we want to reflect that on the model. So highlight all of the raised areas of the hair as you have done with all the other models, but this time with Baneblade Brown. Don't forget to do the ponytail on the back. Next it's time for Gorthor Brown, and we're going to use that to highlight all of the other regular leather brown on the model, as you have done with all the others we've done so far. Now we're going to switch back to Eshin Grey, and we're going to highlight all of the black areas. So in this case we want to do the handles on the axes, so just make sure they've got a nice sharp highlight on the edge. Now it's time for Khorne Red, and we're actually going to make some of that red stand back out again. We gave it a heavy wash with Nuln Oil, so it's really darkened it down. And we want to just catch the raised areas, avoiding the recesses, but slightly thicker than you would do for a normal highlight, because all we're doing is re-brightening it. Now we're going to get out Wazdakka Red, and we're going to go for the proper highlight. So exactly as you did on Boromir's tunic, we're doing on Gimli's tunic as well. Once that's done, he's going to look like this. That's his armour finished. All you need to do is paint his face, which is a little bit difficult with Gimli because it's literally his cheeks, his lip and the top of his nose. You've got to be really careful painting it. When it's done, it will look something like this. And here's Gimli fully based and ready for the table. Don't be deceived by the lighting in the videos. It's actually a lot duller than it looks. It's because I've got some LED ring lights on the model so you can see what I'm doing. But this is how it'll actually turn out on the table. So now we're on to the hobbits. We're going to start with Frodo, the man himself, the ring bearer. And to do that, we're going to need some Rhinox Hide. Now these are really tiny models, so take your time. For Frodo, we're going to paint in his shirt. I say his shirt, it's more like his waistcoat, and the jacket that's on top of that. Both of those are going to be brown. Next, grab some Corvus Black, and we're going to use that to paint in Frodo's trousers. Next, you're going to need Caliban Green, and that's to paint in Frodo's cloak, which is entirely green. So make sure you get the bit between his legs, the bits going up the sides, spin him round, and then do all of the back. Now you're going to need some Iron Hand Steel to paint in Sting. Very simple process. It's a small sword, just be careful. Next you're going to need Abaddon Black, and that is to paint in one single thing, and that is Frodo's hair. And this is what Frodo should look like up to this point, just for reference. Now it's time to grab your Nuln Oil. Yes, we've reached that stage already. They're only tiny little models, so cover it like you have done all the other models, let it dry, and then we can paint the rest of the details. Now you're going to get some Waaagh Flesh, and we're going to use that to highlight Frodo's cloak, exactly the same as we have done on Aragorn's jacket and on Legolas's tunic. We're just going to catch all of the raised areas and make it stand out. And here's what Frodo will look like up until this point. Those highlights are really kicking in and making it pop a little bit more than if we'd just left it as it was. The next level of highlight we're going to need is Straken Green, and just as we did with Legolas's tunic, we're going to give some extreme edge highlights just to bring out that green even more. Next we're going to need Gorthor Brown, and that's to highlight all of the brown areas exactly as we have done all the other times we've used it. After that we're going to switch back to Baneblade Brown again, and we're going to do some extreme highlights just down the edge of Frodo's tunic and his jacket to make it look a little bit more worn. Next we're going to use Eshin Grey. I'm going to highlight the black trousers on Frodo's legs, and then we're going to paint his hair in the same fashion as we did Aragorn's. After we've done that, we're going to switch to Dawnstone, and we're going to do a really fine highlight on his trousers to make them look a little bit worn. Once you've done the highlight on his trousers, we're then going to switch to doing highlights on his hair, but instead of doing lines following down all of his hair like we did on Gandalf, etc., we're just going to pick two areas going around the top of his head like miniature crowns, and we're just going to pick those areas out to do, which will make it look like shine as opposed to the whole thing being grey. And this is, in theory, what it should look like when it's done. As you can see, when he's on the table from the top, he'll look really good, and everyone's going to be super impressed. Next, you've got to paint in all of his skin and then his eyes, as we have done with all the other models, and this is what he will look like. But don't forget that the hobbits will need some Rhinox Hide on their toes to paint their little hair tufts. After that, you'll need some Gorthor Brown, and we're just going to highlight that foot fur, the foot hair, the stuff on their feet. And to do that, you're just going to need to do some little dots of Gorthor Brown to make it look like curly little hairs. And here's what your finished, painted and based Frodo will look like when he joins the Fellowship, ready to hit the table and not do a great deal of damage. Now it's time to paint Meriadoc Brandybuck. First you're going to need some Caliban Green, and that is to paint in Merry's jacket. He's wearing a green one, so it's quite easy. Just make sure you cover all of the areas, but with Merry you want to make sure you don't get any paint on the cloak, because his cloak is grey and it's already painted grey, so let's save ourselves the time. If you do happen to make a mistake, then obviously get out some Mechanicus Standard Grey and just paint over it. Next, grab your Corvus Black and paint in Merry's trousers. That's the only thing he's wearing that's black, so nice and easy. Next, you need to switch to Rhinox Hide. We use that to paint in the leather details, which is his little backpack and then the straps going across his chest. Next, we're going to need Zandri Dust, and we're going to paint in his shirt and his hair. Both of those need to be Zandri Dust, and we're going to paint them slightly differently to achieve different results, but this is the base coat. With those done, switch to Iron Hand Steel, and you're going to paint in his sword. That's the only thing he's got on him that's metallic. With that done, switch to Eshin Grey, and we're going to paint in the rock that's in his hand. Once you paint the rock, it's Nuln Oil time. We're going to cover the entire model in Nuln Oil except for the shirt and except for the hair. So you need to be a tiny little bit more accurate than you have been previously. Next we'll need Seraphim Sepia, and you're going to use that to shade the shirt and the hair, basically the bits we didn't do whilst we were using Nuln Oil. Next we're going to return to Zandri Dust, and we're going to bring back up the Zandri Dust for the shirt. Next you're going to highlight the hair with Zandri Dust to bring it back up slightly. Once you've done that, you're going to need Ushabti Bone, and we're going to do exactly the same thing we did with Frodo's hair, where we pick out a ring round the top of the head and just make those stand out. Again, what we're hoping for here is to create the illusion of shine. Next we're going to use Dawnstone, and we're going to use that to highlight the cloak, just as we did with Gandalf's. Next you need some Eshin Grey, and we're going to highlight Merry's trousers just as we did with Frodo's, exactly the same process. Here's what he should look like up to this point, just for your reference in case you've missed anything in the video. So we're highlighting Caliban Green, so we're going to need some Waaagh Flesh, just as we have done with all the others in the video. Pick out all of the raised areas, be nice and careful, make sure you've got a good tip on your brush. After that you're going to need Straken Green, and we're going to do the same process again, but some very, very fine edge highlights. We're kind of used to this now, we've done it on a few models, so it should be nice and easy. Keep that point nice and fine, keep the paint watered down, simple. Next is a quick bit of Gorthor Brown, which is going to highlight the straps and his backpack. Won't take you very long at all. Paint his face and eyes and base him, and you'll have a completed Merry, looking really, really good, especially under appropriate lighting. Now it's time to paint this very popular hobbit. What about breakfast? What about second breakfast? It's the man himself. It's Pippin. Ignore the bit of sprue I had to cut off his cloak. It was a bit annoying, so I trimmed it off mid-video. We're going to start with Khorne Red, and we're going to paint in his cloak. Now every area of this model is getting painted, so it doesn't matter if you overlap onto the other areas when you're painting this layer. Next we're going to switch to Corvus Black, which is the only thing that's black on Pippin, so it won't take you very long at all. Next we're switching to Macragge Blue, and we're going to paint in his jacket. Make sure you're nice and careful at this stage and that you don't overlap the blue paint onto any others. If you do, obviously just correct them with the necessary colour. Now you're going to need Rhinox Hide, and we're going to paint in his hair and his scarf. Now you need Iron Hand Steel, and we're going to paint in the sword. Eshin Grey is next on our list, and we're going to use that to paint the rock in his hand, and that's it. Equip yourself with some Nuln Oil, and it's that stage again. We're going to paint the entire model to make everything stand out. Once that's dry we can start highlighting. As always it's Calgar Blue to highlight the Macragge Blue jacket. Go around the edge with some nice fine highlights, but don't forget to go around his pocket as well. Next is Wazdakka Red, and we're going to use that to highlight, you guessed it, the cloak. Exactly the same process as before. You should be a veteran of it after having painted 6 or 7 other members of the Fellowship. Go back to Eshin Grey, and we're going to highlight the trousers exactly the same way that we have done before. You're going to get bored of me saying it now. Grab your Dawnstone, we're going to use that to do a very ultra fine highlight on the trousers and also to highlight the rock. You'll see some nice prominent lines on the rock which denote the edges. Just give those a little paint with Dawnstone, it'll make it stand out a little bit more. Gorthor Brown is next, we're going to use that to highlight the scarf that's hanging down between his jacket. Now exactly the same as Gimli, we're going to use Doomball Brown, and we're going to pick a couple of points around the top of Pippin's head, and we're going to add a little highlight in to denote some shine, but it's going to be a kind of reddy shine. And for reference, here's Merry up until now with all his clothing and weaponry painted. And faced and based, here's what your Pippin should look like, all ready for the tabletop and good to go. Grab your Corvus Black, we're going to dive straight in on Sam the Man himself by painting his trousers. Once you finish with his trousers, you'll need to paint in all of his cloak. Once that's done, switch to Rakarth Flesh, and we're going to paint in his shirt. Now we're going to need our staple medium brown of Rhinox Hide, and we're going to paint in the brown details on Sam, which consists of the straps going across his chest down to his little side pouch on his left hip, his backpack under all of his sausages he's carrying, and then the straps of his bag going round each arm. Next we're going to use Zandri Dust, and we're going to paint his hair as we have done with Merry, Legolas and Gandalf, and we're also going to paint the bedroll that's on top of his backpack. Now you're going to need some Cadian Fleshtone. Instead of painting his face, we're actually going to paint all the sausages hanging from his backpack. You will need to give them a couple of coats because Cadian Fleshtone is quite transparent over this grey. Now we're going to use Iron Hand Steel and we're going to paint in his sword, his saucepan and all of the pots, pans and ladles hanging from his backpack. Next it's time for Nuln Oil, and this is going all over the model but not on his hair. That's the only place you need to leave. As always, Seraphim Sepia for the hair. We're going to do exactly the same process as we've done before. Seraphim Sepia all over it to make all that detail stand out. Now we're going to get out some Administratum Grey because we want Sam's cloak to look a little bit more worn than normal. So on all of the folds, like we have done painting every other jacket, you're just going to use some very fine lines of Administratum Grey to make it all stand out. Now with Eshin Grey we're going to edge highlight all of Sam's cloak and his trousers. With that completed, we're going to do a fine edge highlight of Dawnstone over those areas we've just done with Eshin Grey, but use it very sparingly because less is more when it comes to these kind of highlights. To highlight the shirt we're going to use Pallid Witch Flesh, and that's going to allow us to bring out the detail of what is only a very small piece of the model, but it works nonetheless. Gorthor Brown, once again we're going to use that to highlight all of the browns, all of the straps that are going down, make sure some nice thin lines going down there to bring out that detail, make it stand out. Now it's time for Zandri Dust again. We're going to use this predominantly to paint Sam's hair. Now Sam's hair isn't as bright blonde as some of the other characters, it's more of a straw colour. So all we're going to do is use Zandri Dust to pick out the hairs just as we have done with previous characters, but we're then going to leave it there. Crack open your Baneblade Brown. I'm going to use that to do some very, very fine edge highlights on all of the brown areas because we want it to look worn. After that, paint his face, paint his eyes, paint his feet, do the little tufts of hair on his feet, and that is Sam completed and ready to go on the table, beating stuff up with his frying pan. And so here we have it, the full Fellowship of the Ring completely painted, and it will have been an emotional journey of self-discovery without a doubt, especially if you're new to painting to an extra level beyond just the tabletop standard. If you've enjoyed it, please do like, subscribe, check out the other Lord of the Rings videos I've got going on, learn how to paint some other stuff. Hopefully I'll get myself the Osgiliath box set and we'll paint all of that as well. So yeah, thanks very much for watching, happy wargaming.